Hi, it's Liz. Welcome to another video. That's a dumb intro. Okay, anyway, I am again apologizing for my state. um, so I mentioned this like once on this channel, but I have celiac, um, which is a disease that involves gluten intolerance. Um, but I don't want to get into the whole thing, but it really messes up your whole body. Um, it messes up, I mean, obviously, your digestive system. It seems kind of obvious because it is triggered by eating something, but it affects your whole body. It's an autoimmune disease, and yeah. So the reason I feel so terrible is so I got gluten sometime last week, which is sort of celiac slang for I accidentally ate gluten somehow last week. And I hadn't really, at the time of my last video, I was already feeling it, but I hadn't really put two and two together. Um, but anyway, by yesterday, I was feeling good, and I got it in my head because I needed to stay up and cook some food while everyone was asleep, and I got it in my head that I should enjoy a cocktail while I do that. So I made myself a cocktail with a single shot of liquor, and I drank about 40% of it. Um, and just wasn't that into it. I didn't get drunk, although it did kind of affect me a lot. And then this morning, had a really bad hangover and terrible headache and light sensitivity, and I puked a lot, and it was pretty. It's. I'm feeling kind of better now, but anyway, not at my best. But because this happened, it did inspire me to do this video that I've been thinking about doing, and whatever. It's just sort of off the cuff, but I've been thinking about the connections between um, autism spectrum and generally, like, well, there are specific connections between autism and celiac, and more generally with digestive system issues. There's connection between celiac and bipolar, and more generally, um, psychosis and mania and that kind of thing. And there's connections between bipolar and autism. Now, I'm not an authority, and I think my impression from reading some of the research is that these links are not understood. Um, so you know, yeah, I don't care to go into trying to talk about the details of or speculate about um, where the science is at exactly, because I'm not sure. It's just sort of it's been noticed that there are these correlations, and of course they're just correlations. I mean, like for the bipolar autism link, it's like there's a significantly higher rate of people on the autism spectrum being diagnosed bipolar. And to use that as an example, like, what does that mean exactly? What does that mean? I mean, it could just mean that a lot of people are being misdiagnosed bipolar, which is something that happens a lot. It's a commonly misdiagnosed thing. But it also could be that there's something about the autistic neurotype that lends itself towards developing bipolar disorder, or that there's genetic a genetic link between the two, that maybe there's some overlap in the genes involved in um, predisposing people to bipolar disorder, um, and autism. It's unknown. Um, what I wanted to talk about is what I know, and from my experience. And what I know is that they all exacerbate each other. So it's kind of a weird, like, I really, I feel really weird talking about this stuff sometimes because, um, I don't have the most severe celiac case. I know some people for whom they've had life-threatening complications, and that can happen. Celiac is not something to be taken lightly, but I don't have the worst case of it. I've never experienced anything like that, at least yet. Um, but I can manage that pretty well. I don't feel like it's a huge deal, but it is a big part of my life at the same time because I have to avoid gluten to keep it from being a huge deal. Um, and that can be challenging. Um, you know, with the autism spectrum, like, I mean, I know people don't like functioning labels, and I understand why. And I'll link a video about what I'm talking about in case you don't know what I mean by functioning labels. But I mean, I still feel like I'm on the mild end of the spectrum. I don't know how to. I mean, I know it's not a line. The autism spectrum is not a line. It's kind of more of it's a collection of it's a cluster of traits that people can have more and less of. But I just feel like overall in my life, the autism spectrum is not something that causes me great distress or that has caused me, you know, all very much. I don't have acute symptoms. I'll put it that way. I don't really have a lot of acute symptoms except the times when I have shutdowns or meltdowns. That's definitely acute. But most of the time, it's not. So I'm mild. And then, with bipolar, I mean, I don't have mild bipolar. I have hardcore bipolar, but I'm medicated well. So it's kind of it's become a virtual non-issue as long as I just take my meds and like don't smoke meth or something. I guess you freebase meth, huh? I've never done meth and I'm not going to. The point is it's not a huge thing that I'm worried about. And so so it just kind of seems like it's a lot of little things. Um and I don't talk about these things because I'm trying to um paint myself as having a really hard life or like having it worse than other people or something. It's more that like it's unique. Like this is a unique experience I have, and I think it's good for all of us to bring our unique experiences to the table so that we can learn from each other. That's more where I'm coming from. But there is kind of it's kind of invisible the way that these three issues for me interact with each other. They're not separate, and so each one might not be that big of a deal most of the time, but they can, if the conditions are right, they can really create kind of a perfect storm together, and cause real problems real fast. So I just want to talk a little bit about if I was a good YouTuber, I'd have like a flow chart made for you. But basically this is it, right? So the celiac, I'm just going to talk about input and output. Um, so I'll start with what the celiac does, how celiac affects my brain. And again, I don't know the specifics of the science about it. I'm not sure that the science about it is really fleshed out. Like I know there's this idea that there's a lot of nervous system connections between the gut and the brain. But I don't really know what that means, and I don't think scientists really know what that means either at this point. Um, so, whatever. What I do know is that because celiac makes my whole body inflamed, it inflames my brain. And it causes a lot of people with celiac use words like brain fog um, to describe it. So that's one aspect of a mental effect. Um, and what is brain fog? It's like it almost feels like, yeah, it feels like fog because it's like you can kind of think, but then your own thoughts become obscured. Like you're you're trying to just sort of see through all this dense fog, and sometimes you're like, oh, okay, that's a thing that makes sense, but then where's the rest of it? Like where's the other parts of this thought? Like I know there was more to it than that. It's not like it's a weird thing to, it's somewhat distinct from just being tired or just being forgetful. It's like it's kind of its own thing. And it and one effect that has is that it really impedes my already poor executive function. Um, so executive function being, the parts of your, like your brain, the brain function that allows you to plan and execute tasks, basically. Um, and ideally to do so, efficiently, decisively, in ways that are logical and, um, to be able to prioritize things in a way that makes sense. All of that is executive function. So it's really when that's already a challenge, and then you throw brain fog into it, that's a huge stumbling block. Another thing celiac does specifically to the brain, though, when I talk about like brain inflammation, because the way it feels like my brain's on fire, and that's a mental and emotional experience. Like it makes me feel very raw and very um, emotionally reactive in a way that isn't normal for me. Um, it's not exactly like, I wouldn't frame it like it's like getting your feelings hurt easily or something like that, like being hormonal, but it's more like it's a lot easier for things to feel unpleasant or intense. And it's a lot easy to, like, for me, I tend to get um, angry more easily, or and yeah, I mean, I guess hurt, but it's different from that hormonal swing, because it almost feels, it doesn't feel as emotional as hormonal hormone swings do. It it's more being intensely agitated and kind of mentally and emotionally in pain already, and then anything that happens is more likely to make you feel intensely agitated or intensely hurt, just because you're already very raw. Um, so it's like it's emotional, but it almost feels more physiological than like normal emotions, and especially hormonal emotions feels like super emotional. I don't know if that makes any sense. So anyway, that I mean that has a big impact. I mean, especially that with I mean, the thing is, a lot of autism symptoms are really brought on by stress and brought on by stimulus and brought on by, lack of physical well being. So, I mean, celiac also just makes you super fatigued and tired. Um, it makes you feel, I mean, it can cause all kinds of like aches and pains and um, stomach pains. It can make it hard to eat, which makes it hard to plan. You might have to really restrict your diet just to things that are very soothing for your stomach and that you can digest well, um, which requires more planning. But it also, all of that just puts stress on your body, and that puts stress on your mind, and that can make those autism symptoms start to come out. I mean, especially when your brain is feeling um, so raw that that leads itself right into sensory issues really quickly. Sensory stuff that you might normally be able to deal with, okay, but then you add in this other variable um, of what celiac's doing to your brain, and it's a lot harder. It can be, it can trigger that kind of thing. And with bipolar, I can't say I totally understand. It wasn't something that I was ever paying a lot of attention to um, when I was unmedicated. But I don't doubt that there's an interplay. And um, I know that when I was still eating gluten and I was unmedicated, um, that I was just much less in control of my emotions. I mean, I wasn't in control because I don't know. My emotions were just all over the place all the time, um, and that was creating chaos in my life. And you know, bipolar stuff definitely like thrives on chaos um, and emotional stress. So, but I know that there's also this thing that can happen where like people with celiac can just sort of become psychotic or become kind of have symptoms that are similar to mania. I think that happens when when they're undiagnosed usually, but and so they're eating gluten all the time. But yeah, there's definitely I mean it just agitates your brain, so I'm not surprised that it can trigger bipolar stuff or that there's a link. So then of course being bipolar like how does the bipolar stuff affect the rest of the system? Well, like when you're manic all the time, for one thing, it's much harder. It makes executive function harder on a different level because everything is so exciting and so interesting, and your brain is kind of hopping around. Like you, you can't control your enthusiasm. You can't control your attention. So it maybe is a little bit similar to like ADHD. Um, Although it's really different. It's really different. I mean, for one thing, people with ADHD can often like safely take, Adderall or something. You would not want to give Adderall to somebody who is manic. Although somebody did once. I did take Adderall when I was manic, and that was a bad idea. Um, and it did not help. I did enjoy it though. Um, so anyway, yeah, you can't focus because you have all of these ideas and you're so excited about them, and very quickly you're just all over the place. And so you're not prioritizing in a way that makes sense, as I mentioned before. um, you're not really able to plan. You might not even really be able to execute because it's easy to start doing something and then suddenly there's something else that is the glamorous, exciting thing, and you just drop whatever else you were doing and do that. And so it very quickly, especially if you're somebody whose executive function isn't good to begin with, it's very quickly you're living in a chaotic mess, um, that you might love and be excited about, but it's chaotic, and that chaos, definitely has interactions with autistic symptoms and autism, and with, feeds back into the bipolar itself, and it also feeds into the celiac, because it's when you're very impulsive and you're not planning things well. It's difficult to eat a good gluten-free diet. It's difficult to eat any gluten-free diet, especially if you're taking a lot of risks, right? And I guess for a normal person, it might not seem like a big risk to like eat a gluten-free muffin that was touching a gluten muffin or something like that. But in a celiac world, that is a big risk. You know, you're risking damaging your body. You're risking being sick for a week to a few weeks. Um, it's yeah. um, so yeah, that feeds in there, and then autistic symptoms. I mean, for me, the executive function is the thing that is a constant. Um, and so the executive function, being able to manage any illness well, requires executive function. If you're expected to manage it yourself, so that's been a stumbling block. Like learning to, for instance, take my medication every day. Um, and this is not because I was not compliant. I became compliant relatively quickly when it came to medication, but just remembering to take it every day. I mean, I've struggled to brush my teeth every day, and and that's a kind of embarrassing thing to admit as a 33-year-old. But I still struggle with that. I actually have managed to master taking my meds every day, though. But that kind of thing is hard. Learning habits is hard for me, and keeping them is even harder once chaos hits, and once my routine gets disturbed. It's very difficult for me to rebuild it. So so yeah, that's been a stumbling block in managing bipolar disorder, just managing my overall health, which affects all of these things, which is connected to all of these things. Managing celiac, which requires that, I mean, unless I start bringing in $200,000 a year or something, I have to cook most of my own food from scratch in order to avoid getting sick. Um, because people who eat gluten have the luxury of eating, you know, food from cheap restaurants, and eating, cheap pre-made food, or cheap, frozen food. That might seem like a luxury because it's not really good food, but it is easy. And sometimes some of it's good and like not expensive, even if it's not, cheap. But the gluten-free equivalent of those things, I mean, for one thing, it's just not always accessible. It's not always there, depending on where you live and what you have access to. And if it is, it's like considerably more expensive. Um, so, and so, I mean, of course, I don't want to like complain like, oh, I have to eat whole foods and whatever. I mean, it's not a bad thing, but it does require more work, and it does require more planning, and that's hard. So yeah, so it's a system, and of course, I think in to be general in Western thought, we tend to focus on linear relationships, or we don't even really focus on relationships. We focus on, we see three different disorders, and then we might, if we're really savvy, start making connections like I did, and like input, output, this affects this, this affects this, this affects this. Um, but really, I mean, that's not even a great model because they all exist inherently in relationship to one another and to my whole self. I mean, it's a whole system that doesn't, it's not modeled well by, um, just drawing arrows here and there. It's all just deeply connected and it's not separate. So yeah, that's just my musings about this. I'm very, very interested in, you know, to find out more about what the connections between these particular issues are, though, because I definitely don't think it's what am I trying to say? I definitely don't think that these three issues are independent variables. So statistically, that would, if they were independent variables, that is to say that like each one, um, there was no correlation between them or overlap between them, then it would be astronomically, it would seem like I had three very rare things or relatively uncommon things. And having all three of them would make it seem very rare. But the reality is, it's not. Having these combinations of things isn't rare. Um, and so I'm really interested to see what that means, um, if we ever find out. So, if you have anything to contribute to that conversation, please let me know. I'm super curious. All right. Wish me a good day. I wish you a good day.